In the aftermath of the collapse of the Almohad Caliphate, the people of Al-Andalus were staring down the barrel of the Christian gun. They needed someone who could defend them. In these circumstances, Ibn Hud, a descendant of the Banu Hud of Zaragoza, claimed the title of Amir al-Muslimin, the leader of the Muslims. His first task was to deal with the Christian threat. In March 1230 CE, he went north to confront the king of Leon, who was laying siege to Merida, and the Knights of Santiago, who had taken over Montiches. Despite his own courage and the superior number of his troops, he was decisively defeated at Alangi near Badajoz. The defeat was a disaster for Al-Andalus. Not only were Badajoz and its countryside soon lost, but the credibility of Ibn Hud as a leader was fatally damaged, and many Andalusians who had previously supported him began to look elsewhere. In the same year, Fernando III of Castile succeeded his estranged father Alfonso IX as the King of Leon, so reuniting the kingdoms of Leon and Castile. This union was an event of major importance in the history of Reconquista. The two kingdoms had been divided since the death of Alfonso VII in 1157 CE, and throughout the 73 years of separation, the kings of Leon had regarded the Castilians as the chief threat and the Almohads as potential allies. The union of Leon and Castile and the coming of age of James of Aragon Catalonia meant that the political problems of the Christian kingdoms were at an end, and both Castile and Aragon were led by young and ambitious monarchs. This was fateful news for the divided and leaderless Muslims of Al-Andalus. In the same year, the full force of Christian power was felt by Majorca. The last governor of Majorca had been harassing Christian ships in the region and hence pissed them off to no end. Aragon attacked in 1230 CE and Majorca fell. The people of Minorca, however, formed their own kingdom and became tributaries of Aragon. Under the rule of the wise and learned Sayyid ibn Hakam al-Qurayshi, the island even became something of a center of Muslim culture. All this was brought to an end, however, when the Aragonese invaded the island in 1282 CE and sold virtually the entire Muslim population as slaves, repopulating it with Catalans. In addition to Banu Hud, another powerful family was the Banu Mardanish, who had refused to recognize Ibn Hud as their leader. They formed power in Valencia and its surrounding area. Their rule was dominated by a losing battle with the Aragonese and the gradual erosion of their domain. The Aragonese advance was severe. Zian ibn Mardanish lost city after city to Aragon. The last desperate battle, known to the Muslim as the Battle of Anisha, was the end of Valencia. In the aftermath of the disaster, the final siege of Valencia began. And on 22nd of September 1236 CE, the defenders were obliged to ask for terms. Ibn al-Abbar, who was an eyewitness, describes the scene. Abu Jumail Zian ibn Madafi ibn Sa'd al-Juthami came out of the city of which he was then emir, and the head of his household and the leader of the civil and military administration. The tyrant, James I, dressed in his most splendid clothes and surrounded by his nobles, advanced from the camp at Al-Rusafa, where he had been since the beginning of the siege. They met at Wallaha, immediately southeast of the city, and an agreement was made whereby the tyrant took the city without fighting, and that for 20 days the inhabitants were able to move out with their possessions. I was present at all these events. Zian himself was able to retreat to Denia to the south, but the Christian advance continued. After the assassination of Ibn Hud in Almeria in January 1238 CE, apparently for personal reasons, the people of Murcia chose a new leader, but he is said to have been short of money and failed to resist the Christians. In April 1239 CE, the Murcians turned to Zian ibn Mardanish, whose military reputation had survived the collapse at Valencia. But he too proved unsatisfactory, and at the beginning of 1241 he was driven out and spent the rest of his life in Alicante, and then from 1247 CE in exile in Tunis. The Murcians then turned to the son of Ibn Hud, but their fate was already sealed. The Castilians attacked Murcia, but it survived as a vassal kingdom until it was finally taken over by the Castilians in 1266 CE. Elsewhere, there was a similar situation. Leadership collapsed and local militias desperately tried to defend their cities but failed. In similar circumstances, the heart of Muslim Spain, Córdoba, was hit. Córdoba fell on 29th of June 1236 CE. By 1249-1250 CE, all the cities of the Algarve had fallen to Portugal. In Granada, however, a man named Ibn al-Ahmar was able to secure some power. He even managed to take over Seville for some time, but his governor there was driven out by the public. Christians had reached the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Seville was one of the last cities left. Its people were trying desperately to save it. Rulers were coming and going. Finally, in 1246 CE, a council was installed to rule it. Fun fact here, one of the people on the council was Yahya ibn Khaldun, a relative of the famous historiographer. But it was too late to save Islamic Seville. Many leading citizens had already emigrated to North Africa, and with the Castilians in Cordoba, the Guadalquivir Valley was effectively lost. Fernando, aided by Ibn al-Ahmar, could not take the city by force but had to resort to starving it out. Eloquent pleas in letters and poetry were sent to the North African rulers, and the Hafsids did send a fleet which the Christians drove off. But no help was forthcoming from Morocco, where the last Almohads and the Marinids were occupied by a struggle of their own. Finally, on or about 23rd of November 1248 CE, after a siege of a year and a half, the inhabitants asked for terms. They were given a month to leave with all the possessions they could take. And on 22nd of December, Fernando III entered the city as conqueror. Seville, Cordoba, Valencia, Badajoz, just like that, all major cities were gone. All that remained was Granada. Ibn al-Ahmar had used the relations he built with Fernando to secure himself the Nasrid kingdom of Granada, named after an ancestor of Ibn al-Ahmar, whose real name was Muhammad. Between 1246 CE and 1264 CE, Ibn al-Ahmar was largely at peace with the overmighty Castilian overlords, and these years must have provided a vital breathing space in which the new state could become established. Ibn al-Ahmar established himself in the fortress of Alhambra. The city was flooded with refugees from captured towns and settlements engulfed from the old Al-Qazaba and extended up the hill which came to be known as Al-Baisin by the refugees from Baiza who settled there. It was very densely populated in comparison with the surrounding plains of Christian Andalusia. The kingdom included the modern provinces of Almeria, Granada, Malaga, and some of the most eastern areas of Cadiz. The control of ports like Malaga and Almeria meant that the Italian merchants could come and go without going through the Castilian territories, and that there were direct interactions with the Muslim states of North Africa. Much of the kingdom enjoyed good natural frontiers, steep mountains and ravines in the northwest, and upland semi-desert in the northeast. In two areas, however, it was particularly vulnerable. First was the area to the north of the Strait of Gibraltar, where Tarifa, Algeciras, and Gibraltar itself offered a tempting strategic prize to the Castilians. The second was more central. With the loss of Jaén to the Christians, Granada itself was uncomfortably close to the frontier, which in many cases was less than 50 kilometers away. This meant that there was a constant struggle for the control of the castles, especially on the main invasion routes from the northwest. Much of the warfare between the two sides was concerned with the possession of these small but vital strongholds. The Mudehars were those Muslims who had chosen to live and remain under Christian control. There had been such Muslims in Castile and Aragon for 2 centuries by this time, who seemed to have enjoyed a degree of tolerance and religious freedom and had showed no signs of joining a Muslim rebellion. It was different for those who had been subjected by recent Reconquista. In a few areas like Niebla and Murcia, they enjoyed virtual self-governance under Muslim lords, but in other areas, Christian rule was much more direct and harsher. In 1262 CE, Muhammad ibn al-Ahmar was able to start a war. He had good relations with the Hafsids of Tunisia, who sent support. Soon, he attacked Murcia under the control of the Christians and took over. Some minor cities in the Guadalquivir area were taken as well. However, James I of Aragon retook Murcia, and Alfonso X, son and successor of Fernando III, who had died in 1252 CE, invaded Vega de Granada in 1265 CE. By the end of the year, it was all over, and Ibn al-Ahmar had to make peace as best he could. The failure was a disaster for the Mudehars. Mass expulsion and ethnic cleansing took place in the lands under Castilian rule, the result being that there were virtually no Muslims left in Christian Andalusia. On 22nd of January 1273 CE, Muhammad I of Granada died after falling from a horse. His son, Muhammad II, 38 years of age and experienced in warfare and politics, took over. With Muhammad II's reign, a few important changes happened. First of all, A group of Zenata Berbers moved to Granada. They were political exiles from the Marinids in Morocco, who had filled the vacuum left behind by the collapse of the Almohad Caliphate. They came to be known as Ghazi and had their own leader, who was sometimes even an exiled member of the Marinid dynasty. These Berbers, while incredibly expensive, proved effective in battle. Secondly, when Muhammad II's rule started, he tried to juggle complicated alliances. He was aware of the Castilians eyeing his kingdom and the Marinids to the south just itching to cross the strait. He was allied with whomever was necessary at the moment, but was careful not to allow anyone to establish a foothold in Granada. When Muhammad was declared the heir to Ibn al-Ahmar, a smaller dynasty named Banu Ashkilula had revolted. Muhammad started his reign with them in full revolt. The Banu Ashkilula had taken over Malaga, and the Marinid Sultan came to meet the two parties in an attempt to make peace. This was a little too much like the Almoravid invasion of Al-Andalus for Muhammad to be okay with. Malaga was even given to the Marinid Sultan to use as a base. Muhammad incited the ruler of Tlemcen to attack the Marinid. In the confusion, he was able to secure Malaga for himself. However, this made him a few too many enemies. The Castilians, the Marinids, and the Banu Ashkilula joined forces to invade Granada in 1281 CE. However, the new Berber army proved very effective and was able to push the invaders back. Alfonso X died in 1284 CE, and the Marinid Sultan Abu Yusuf in 1286 CE. Muhammad finally got a little breathing room, which allowed him to end the Banu Ashkilula. The Marinid Sultan still had Tarifa, which meant that a future offensive from the south was not out of question. Muhammad wanted to make sure that he wouldn't be attacked from the south. He, along with Sancho IV, the new ruler of Castile, was able to take Tarifa in 1292 CE. However, even though it was promised to Muhammad, Sancho refused to give Tarifa over to Muhammad. Sancho died in 1295 CE, leaving his young son, Fernando IV, as his successor. Due to this newfound chaos in Castile, Muhammad allied with James II of Aragon and launched an offensive. However, this was nothing more than a raiding mission with some minor forts taken over. Sultan Muhammad II of Granada died in 1302 CE. He was succeeded by his son, Muhammad III. I feel like they were competing with Castile over who had the most rulers of the same name. Muhammad III immediately tried to make peace with Castile, which he was able to do. He, like his father, was much more concerned with the threat to the south. His cousin was the governor of Malaga under the Marinid, and he paid him to start a revolt. He was able to get another dissident of the Marinid rule to side with him and ended up taking Ceuta in Morocco. He was even able to avoid the Marinid Sultan from retaking it. However, his recent triumph did not come without a price. In 1307 CE, the Christian powers put their differences aside and marched to take over Granada once and for all. The Marinid Sultan, with the hopes of taking his land back, joined in. However, before they could all reach Granada, Muhammad III was overthrown in a coup by the elites and his brother Nasr was installed. Nasr realized that he was too weak for what was coming and knew that only diplomacy could save him. He returned Ceuta to the Marinids and urged them to side with him. Instead of taking the war further, the Marinid Sultan was able to broker peace in 1310 CE. The danger was further removed when Fernando IV died in 1312 CE. Due to internal instability, Nasr himself was overthrown in 1314 CE and made a provincial governor. His cousin Ismail became the new sultan. Nasr was trying to ally himself with the Christians in an effort to restore himself. The Castilians launched a major attack on Granada in 1319 CE, but they were decisively defeated at Vega de Granada. This was probably the most decisive victory by the Nasrid Sultanate over the Christians. Ismail even launched counterattacks but was unable to achieve anything of note. He was, however, able to get exactly one knife in his spine when his cousin Muhammad, a different Muhammad than the ones mentioned before, was able to plant one in his back in 1325 CE. His son and heir, Muhammad IV, was still young and unable to rule, and led to factions developing in the background of the Sultanate. He became a puppet for the Berbers, who didn't like that he was developing close relations with the Marinid Sultanate. Keep in mind that the Berber force of Granada was made up largely of exiles from the Marinid Morocco. The young sultan was killed 7 years later in 1333 CE by the Berbers. He was succeeded by Yusuf, his brother, who, as far as Nasrid sultans go, wasn't half bad. Almost since the start of his reign, Alfonso XI of Castile was determined to close up the strait and ensure no large Moroccan forces would land on Al-Andalus. Yusuf realized that this would spell the end of his kingdom and tried to ally with the Marinid Sultan to defend it. The combined force of Granada, Marin Morocco, and Hafsid Tunisia was able to defeat the Christians at sea, but on land, well, not so much. The Battle of Ria Salado in 1340 CE was a decisive defeat for the Muslims. The strait was taken over by the Christians, never to end up in Muslim hands again. And with it, the hopes of a large-scale invasion from Morocco was lost too. The next decade was probably the most peaceful, except for the fall of Algeciras. Yusuf himself was assassinated in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, apparently by a madman, in 1354 CE. He was succeeded by his son, Muhammad V, who was only 16 at the time. My heart aches to continue this goddamn story. Let's just get this over with. See you next time.